And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center and the Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled Decolonizing the Shakespeare Curriculum. We're joined by Thompson, Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University. Today is November the 30th. Welcome back everybody. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center, and on behalf of my team, my staff, Jira and Mike and Meredith, I want to welcome you back from the holiday. I know this is a particularly tight part of your academic calendar because the next holiday is looming just over the horizon, and we, as always, appreciate you spending time with us. As I look around the room tonight, I see some new faces and some very familiar faces, at least in the form of names on my screen. Heather, it's great to have you with us. Heather's from Shrewsbury High School in Massachusetts. Teresa is joining us from Hillsborough Community College down in Florida. Osina is joining us from Park Junior High School in Illinois. Isabel is here from First Street Elementary in Los Angeles. Nearby, SJ is at the Research Triangle High School, and Gary is in Meredith, so nearby me in Durham and Raleigh, North Carolina. Carolyn up there in Winchester, Virginia, and Cassandra, it's great to have you here. Cassandra is from the Theater for a New Audience based in New York. As I look around the room, I'm always struck by the wide variety of educators and humanists who join us for our webinar series. And I hope that's because what we really aim to do is concentrate on provocative and compelling and emerging understandings of these various topics. And tonight, I think looking at something as iconic and well-known and sort of the canon of William Shakespeare, but doing so through a different lens may give you some inspiration and some ideas of how you can unlock the power of the bard for your younger students, regardless of the age they might be. As you know, the National Humanities Center is in Durham, North Carolina, and each year we welcome a fellowship class. This is, it's always nice to have these 35 or 36 scholars come and spend their year with us, do their writing, do their researching, have lunch with us. But I'll tell you what it really does is it allows us, and me personally, to get to know the galaxy of scholars that they're associated with. And I can tell you that I first heard about Professor Thompson's work from a past fellow, Kim Hall, who was with us 3 years ago, and I think her name might emerge as we go through tonight's presentation. All of the work that we're sharing tonight and the content that we create at the center is intended to be free and open for all educators. I do encourage you to use the library card for the Humanities in Class Digital Library to search for and access and implement new resources and new understandings, new ways that scholarship can be infused in your instructions and, your instruction and in your classroom. That does include the resources associated with tonight's session. The readings and the resources that we pulled together and Professor Thompson suggested can all be found in the subfolder that corresponds with the title of tonight's webinar in the Humanities in Class webinar series group. Please do join that and use this as a place to revisit the material after the session, and also to view and have access to the recordings of tonight's session afterwards. I've worked with a lot of educators recently who take those recordings, particularly because my colleague Jira sections them into smaller chunks so that you can use them topically, and finds ways to use them with their students, maybe in a flipped classroom model, or perhaps as a formative assessment before they engage in something. And I would encourage you to use it in those kinds of ways. Those materials can be found, and again, they all come with an open Creative Commons license, and I do hope that you find them valuable. I suspect that many of you are here tonight because of your love of or interest in the ways that language and literature help us understand who we are. We have a very compelling slate of spring webinars already on the books, and I know many of you have gone through and signed up for these already, but please do revisit that. If your calendar is starting to free up or certain topics are starting to emerge and things that you like to understand better, I do encourage you to join us for any and all of these sessions. I'm in particular looking forward to talking and working with Scott Saul in March on the ways that the irreverent language of the 1970s, the comedians, Richard Pryor and Archie Bunker, were really used to address offensive language and do so in a positive way. And now when all of us are constantly thinking about the ways that we speak and the words that we use and the choices we make, hopefully Professor Saul will be able to shed some light on that. I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council. I see several of them in the room with us tonight for their ongoing collaborations and contributions. You know, this has been a wacky 18 months, and for them to stay as connected and engaged and to contribute the way they do is really invaluable to us, and it's something that we greatly value. The other thing we value, though, is your input. Many of you may have received an email from me today titled Humanities in Class Community Survey. You know, it's been a couple of years since we really surveyed our audience, and so we put together what we hope will be a comprehensive snapshot of the work that we do through your lens and your eyes. And we would really like to know what is helpful and what is meaningful for you, what can be constructed differently, what some of the obstacles might be. So we put together a survey. I emailed it to you today. It should take about 10 minutes. I have 15 on the screen, but that's if you're particularly thoughtful, and I would encourage you to do so. We're going to leave the survey open for the next 2 weeks, and before each webinar, we're going to choose in a drawing one of the participants who have completed the survey and give them a choice from a menu of humanities-based items. That does include books from that correspond with all of the webinars this fall, including Professor Thompson's most recent book. It also could be a free online course. Those come with 35 professional development credit hours. It could be an NHC swag bag that includes all kinds of things that will give you a chance to represent the center wherever you may live. And if you live in North Carolina or you'd like to come and visit, we'd also love to have you join us at the center for lunch one day and see the Commons and meet the fellows and get to know us over a really wonderful meal that we have every day. So before every webinar, we're going to draw from those who have completed the survey. Obviously, the earlier you complete it, the more chances you have to be chosen. So we'll be doing this 6 times, and again, we'll close this on December the 17th. I sent this email out today. If you didn't receive it for some reason, I'm going to put the link to it in the chat box right now. I don't think you can touch your screen and open it, but you can certainly cut and paste it. I have a feeling that some of them, because it's a mass email, some of your spam filters may have hung up. It may have hung up in your spam filter, or I think sometimes Gmail actually restricts the number of emails you can send at once. So they're probably doing it in sections over several hours. So if you haven't received the survey, there's the link. We would love to have your contributions and your thoughts as we plan for the 2022-2023 academic year. So as promised, I'm going to draw a name from those who have completed the survey so far. And this person will be able to choose from this menu of items, including one of 20 titles of featured books in our webinar series this fall. And the winner is, hey, Nestor Rave, come on down. Nestor Rave is a library associate at Bowling Green University in Huron, Ohio. Nestor is our first winner of the survey drawing. I'll get in touch with Nestor. I'll give him a mechanism to choose his prize. And the next drawing will be before Thursday night's webinar that's scheduled for just 2 days from now. So as a reminder, your contributions tonight are really invaluable. Professor Thompson's got just a wonderful talk and presentation outlined and put together, but it's your communications that's really going to help make this a vibrant and relevant conversation. Please do continue to chat in the chat box, share links, interact with each other. If you have a formal question, though, and you'd like to submit it for Professor Thompson's consideration, drop it in the Ask the Professor tab, and as the moderator, I'll bring that forward when the time is right. So once again, you have joined us for the Humanities in Class webinar series episode titled Colonizing the Shakespeare Curriculum. Tonight's session is being led by Ira Thompson, Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University. I'm very pleased to have Teacher Advisory Council member Josh Cabot, who is an English teacher at Roslyn High School in Roslyn Heights, New York, joining us as the TA. Josh is going to be in the chat box. He's going to be dropping links and asking questions. And again, as always, I do appreciate his ongoing contributions. So that's my introduction. Professor Thompson, can you hear me all the way out there in Phoenix?
I can. Can you hear me across the world?
I can, and it's still a little odd that we can do this. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, it's been a busy and full semester, and I appreciate you spending time with us. And I hope that the fact that I'm about to put you on the spot doesn't contradict my gratefulness. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Go ahead.
At the beginning of tonight's session, as folks were getting settled, I put a prompt on the screen. In fact, I'm going to go back to it right now. And this is a question that I suspect many teachers of younger students and even college professors of slightly older but still younger students get asked, and that is, wait a minute, hold on for a second. This guy lived 500 years ago. Why does he still matter? To you, Professor Thompson, why does Shakespeare still matter?
I think Shakespeare still matters because he includes a lot of themes and ideas that are still timely and relevant for us. But I also think he still matters because we've made him matter. And so that'll be some of maybe what might be slightly uncomfortable some issues that I'll be raising today. But this is also to say, I am not someone who wants to cancel Shakespeare.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'm going to maybe probe into that just a little bit. You know, on one hand, your answer, and I think what a lot of the folks in the chat box said was, which is true, right? It's he offers this prism of the human condition, these kind of universal and eternal realities that we all experience. But it almost sounds like you're suggesting that we can also use him to look at other realities that maybe weren't looked at for a long, long time. Do you find that literature generally, but Shakespeare specifically, is that kind of window pane that we can look through and really study and get a sense of what is going on in this human world?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what makes the study of literature important is the way that it allows us to empathize with different people, different times, different situations, but also allows us to interrogate our own situations. So I'm not sure I would argue that Shakespeare's universal. I do think there are a lot of things in Shakespeare's plays that we might not want to be universal. Right. But I do think that his plays continue to be timely. And I think there's a slight difference there that I think is also important to probe with our students.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, we're looking forward to your guidance on those kinds of questions tonight. I'm going to turn the PowerPoint over to you. And again, as the moderator, I'll be bringing questions to you on occasion and clarifications that might be asked.
And you should interrupt me at any point. And I want to say thanks, of course, to you, Andy and Jira, and everyone at the National Humanities Center for having me. I love teachers. I am the child of a long-term English teacher in the Baltimore City schools. And I saw that there's an Emily Kavanaugh who's from Columbia, Maryland, and I am from Columbia, Maryland. So I went to high school at Centennial High School. So
it's nice to see that connection.
Yeah, and I also want to say hi to everyone from Theater for a New Audience, a theater that I am involved with and love and have a lot of respect for. So thanks to everyone. So I'll start with a slight history that may seem like it takes us from Shakespeare, but hopefully you'll understand why I'm beginning there. Recently, there have been many discussions about decolonizing the curriculum. But what exactly does this mean for the teaching of literature and history in secondary schools? And what does it mean for the teaching of Shakespeare in particular? I'll take us back to a book that was originally published in 1989 by Gauri Vishwanathan. As Vishwanathan explored in her groundbreaking book, Masks of Conquest, Shakespeare's place in the English literary curriculum was unique because his plays were included from the inception of English literature as a field of study. So I'm going to read some passages, like I think it's a few passages directly from her book, just so that I don't mangle her arguments. She says, "It's important to understand," and this is a quote, "that the discipline of English came into its own in the age of colonialism," end quote. Vishwanathan goes on to argue that, quote, "no serious account of its growth and development can afford to ignore the imperial mission of educating and civilizing colonial subjects in the literature and thought of England, a mission that in the long run served to strengthen Western cultural hegemony in enormously complex ways. She goes on to argue, the amazingly young history of English literature as a subject of study, it is less than 150 years old. I will repeat, it's less than 150 years old, is frequently noted, but less appreciated is the irony that English literature appeared as a subject in the curriculum of the colonies long before it was institutionalized in the home country. As early as the 1820s, when the classical curriculum still reigned supreme in England, despite the strenuous efforts of some concerned critics to loosen its hold, English as a study of culture and not simply the study of language had already found a secure place in the British Indian curriculum. So the study of English in England was usually just the study of the language, but when you were studying literature, you were studying classical literature. So the study of English literature as a field actually started in colonial India first. And Shakespeare's entrance into that part of the curriculum occurred because, and this is a quote from 1852 by the Reverend William Keene, because, and here's the quote, Shakespeare, though by no means a good standard, is full of religion. It is full of the common sense principles which none but Christian men can recognize, sound Protestant Bible principles, though not actually told in words, are there set out to advantage, and the opposite often condemned, end quote. So Keene and others who were involved in developing the colonial curriculum in India were arguing that Shakespeare had sound Protestant Bible principles and that studying his characters could help you develop your own character, your own moral character. And particularly for Indians, this was important to the English thought to develop a good moral character would be helpful by understanding Shakespeare, who seemed to offer what they thought of as sound religious principles. So Shakespeare's place in our study of literature came about in colonial India. And Shakespeare's place in the English literary curriculum was deeply entwined in England's colonial project. And Shakespeare's place in the English literary curriculum was at its heart a colonial endeavor. Okay, so when I start there, many alt-right media writers usually end my quotes there and say that I want to cancel Shakespeare. But does this mean that we should give over teaching Shakespeare's plays? Does this mean that a decolonized approach to the curriculum would disallow the inclusion of Shakespeare? No. And even Gauri Viswanathan, in her book back in 1989, said no, she's not arguing for getting away from this. And I just wanted to show you that, like, every 2 months or so, I get kind of brought back into a kind of media storm by what I've realized is usually just one article written by one of the alt-right media sources, and then it gets republished even with different author names, but it's verbatim the same exact article like 250 times in the span of like 2 hours. And this happens every 2 months with critics claiming that I'm trying to cancel Shakespeare. What I'm trying to advocate is something closer to what many of our LGBTQ scholars and activists have been teaching us lately. And that is that we've been brainwashed into binary thinking. We've been taught to view things in binary terms as either or. And I know firsthand that to mention the history of Shakespeare's position in the English curriculum is to invite a type of panicked anger I must want to cancel Shakespeare. But that response is a type of binary thinking, that it must be either Shakespeare or contemporary BIPOC authors, for example. But this is not what decolonized thinking and teaching entails. At the most basic level, decolonized thinking requires deconstructing the thoughts, preferences, values, and especially the methodologies that derive from colonial mentalities and practices. And I want to stress that decolonized thinking is a process and not a destination. It's a method and not an end in and of itself. So you're not suddenly going to become decolonized in your thinking and teaching, and neither will your students arrive at a position of decoloniality. That's not even like a necessary process or a desirable outcome or even a possibility, right? There's no one defined end in mind. Rather, it's a process that creates space for new ways to explore the past. Moreover, a decolonized process is a collaborative one in which students and teachers learn together. After all, decoloniality wants to challenge traditional hierarchies. So to create a decolonized curriculum, the hierarchy between experts and novices will be leveled. Likewise, decolonized thinking requires unlearning as much as it requires learning anew. One of the goals of a decolonized curriculum is that students and teachers will begin to unlearn binary thinking patterns, or at least to recognize when we fall back on them. And unlike people who assume that a decolonized curriculum will cancel Shakespeare by substituting his works for others, which, let's admit it, would be a very easy curriculum to create, a decolonized curriculum is not easy and not simple to construct. There are not a lot of easy ways to do this, I want to tell you up front. It's quite challenging to create a curriculum that allows new ways to view not only literature and history, but also power structures and the meaning and practices of justice. So I just want to pause there for a second to see if there are reactions to Ira Vishwanathan's work and to an understanding about how Shakespeare has fallen into our curriculum. And so, this is basically something from the 1820s onward. No one in Shakespeare's lifetime would have read Shakespeare in school or thought that Shakespeare's plays were universal or could teach us a good moral character. Like, that was just not available to them in their education system. So I wanted to pause, see if there's any comments or questions.
I don't think so, but I wonder if, Professor, I wonder if you can maybe give some examples, maybe an example of each of these things, the way that you've described it can be, and maybe the way that it has been.
Well, I'm going to go on for that. I just wanted to just give a pause there to see if there were I wanted to just pause because I feel like sometimes when people hear this history, it can be quite shocking. So I just wanted to kind of reveal that and then see if there are any responses. But now I will go on to show what we can do in a kind of decolonized approach. Okay. So I always recommend starting with Bell Hooks's essay, The Oppositional Gaze, for teachers who are serious or curious about decolonizing their curriculum. And this essay is chapter 7 in her book, Black Looks, which was first published in 1992. The essay has absolutely nothing to do with Shakespeare, so don't be fooled. But it offers profound insights into what is to be gained when one recognizes that one is not the intended audience for a text or a film or a history. And in this chapter, Hooks describes being the only Black woman in a cinema house and realizing that her reactions to what she was watching on the screen were entirely different from the rest of the white audience. And she then kind of theorizes how that came to be. And so I'm going to read just a few passages from, this is chapter 7 of Black Looks, and it's the chapter called The Oppositional Gaze. So I'll start with this passage. For years, I went to independent and/or foreign films where I was the only Black female present in the theater. I often imagined that in every theater in the United States, there was another Black woman watching the same film, wondering why she was the only Black visible female spectator. And she goes on to kind of historicize what it means to be a Black person looking at a white construction of art. And then she kind of remembers that, and so this is a quote, she was amazed the first time I read in history classes that white slave owners, men, women, and children, punished enslaved Black people for looking. I wondered how this traumatic relationship to the gaze had informed Black parenting and Black spectatorship. The politics of slavery, of racialized power relations, were such that the slaves were denied the right to gaze, right? Denied the ability to look. And then she goes on to say, all attempts to repress our Black people's right to gaze had produced in us an overwhelming longing to look, a rebellious desire, an oppositional gaze. By courageously looking, we defiantly declared, not only will I stare, I want to look to change reality. Even in the worst circumstances of domination, the ability to manipulate one's gaze in the face of structures of domination that would contain it opens up the possibility of agency. And I think this is why I always try and start my classes with bell hooks, to think about, like, are you looking with an oppositional gaze if you're the student? Are you allowing the oppositional gaze if you're the teacher? And how do you create those possibilities of agency in your students? And I think that's what a kind of decolonized approach ultimately wants to achieve. And once you allow this kind of oppositional gaze, what you can get from your students and from yourself, from your colleagues, are new lenses that allow us to see older texts anew. In Shakespeare's Richard II, a character is instructed to view an anamorphic image from the side, right? So she's told, like, if you look at this painting straight on, you won't see it correctly. You have to stand to the side. And it's called, in the text, eyed awry. And Hooks's notion of the oppositional gaze is precisely a way to eye things awry, or what I think she would call side eye awry. And I relate to this. Oh, sorry, might be one slide behind, sorry. I'm right. I relate to this on a deep level because I did not set out to be a Shakespeare scholar. I was trained primarily in post-colonial theory, African American studies, critical race studies, and feminist theory. So I happened to go to Columbia University I started in 1990, and which was at the height of what was called the culture wars at the time. And at Columbia, we have 2 buildings that have the names of, like, the most canonical writers and thinkers on them. And they happen to be, of course, all white men. And so in the 90s, people would periodically hang banners with, like, female authors' names on them, and Black authors' names on them. And so when I was in college, it was very common to think about, like, let's replace the curriculum and let's change what we're reading. And there was a year-long Shakespeare requirement when I was in college, and I thought for sure that it would be that the requirement would be rescinded by the time I needed to graduate. So I didn't take it until my senior year because the requirement was still in place. But I thought for sure Shakespeare would not be required while I was still in school. But this was such a great advantage for me to take it in my senior year because I had in my back pocket all of these classes on post-colonial literature and African-American literature and critical race studies and feminist theory. And so when I opened the Shakespeare texts to read them for the first time, I saw all of the things that we were already talking about in my other classes. I saw the way that he was grappling with race and gender, sexuality, class, ability, shades of whiteness. Like there was everything in Shakespeare that I had been talking about in my other classes. But my Shakespeare professor, who was very famous and very esteemed, he seemed to be reading the text very differently. So on the first day of class, he wanted us to read the plays chronologically. So we started within the first couple of days with Titus Andronicus, which is Shakespeare's first tragedy and has since become my favorite play. And in this play, if you're not familiar with it, I think it's one of the best teaching plays, but it has a lot of extreme violence in it. But it also has a biracial baby. Someone gives birth to a biracial baby, which proves that she's had an affair with an African Moor. And so I thought when we went into class that we're going to spend the whole time talking about racial formations and how they were developing in Shakespeare's lifetime. But my professor didn't even mention it and suggested that I was asking anachronistic questions or questions that didn't apply to Shakespeare's life and times when I attempted to discuss it with him after class. But I realized that I had a different set of tools, that I had an oppositional gaze that I was bringing to the material, that this was all relevant and exciting to me. And this oppositional gaze really enabled me, through all these non-Shakespearean methodologies and tools, allowed me to ask a different set of questions that I've gone on to use in my Shakespeare career. It allowed me to open up the field in new and exciting ways to the history of racial formations, to the history of racialized performances, to the legacy of performances of race on contemporary stages, and to casting practices that we employ when staging Shakespeare today. And I'll just say, Andy knows this because I was scheduled to give this presentation to you all a couple of weeks ago, and I had to cancel quite suddenly because I'm working on the new Broadway production of Macbeth that's starring Daniel Craig and Ruth Negga. And I'm brought on to this production because they want to have very intentional discussions about casting and what racialized and different ability bodies, how they impact our understanding of Shakespeare on the stage. So instead of asking the audience to be blind to those issues, this director, Sam Gold, wants the audience to really grapple with what does it mean to have a Black lady Macbeth and a white Macbeth? And what does it mean to have a non-binary actor, Asia Kate Dillon, play Malcolm, who takes over the realm at the end? And what does it mean to have a disabled actor play one of the henchmen to Macbeth throughout the play? So I don't want to suggest that you, as teachers in secondary schools, that you should be aiming to create another Shakespeare scholar. In fact, I don't think that should be anyone's goal, right? But I do think that you want to create students who can ask new questions. And I know that Gen Z and probably Generation Alpha coming up are going to ask entirely different questions. And I think we also want people who can open up the text in entirely new ways and who will experience a sense of joyful command of Shakespeare's text, even if they acknowledge that some of the things in the text are deeply problematic and offensive to many. After all, these plays have endured for 400 years, not simply because of the history of canon formation, which is what I started with when quoting Gauri Vishwanathan. But also because of their beauty and their mutability. They don't have to stay as texts that only reside 400 years ago. Okay, so I'll pause there for a second.
Great, thank you.
Answer some questions.
We do have some questions that have queued up that I'd like to bring to you now, and I'm going to start with, this is going to take us back a little bit in your talk so far. This question comes from Gary. I cited Gary as being in Raleigh. He's actually in Stanton, up near Charlottesville. Gary asks if you can speak to the history of Shakespeare education in the U.S. compared to that in India.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because in the U.S., similarly, because our country is young compared to England, the education system wasn't set up in exactly the same way that it was in England. Like, so the first schools that were developed in the U.S. were not necessarily trying to replicate the grammar schools that existed in Shakespeare's lifetime. And so Shakespeare did enter into the curriculum fairly early on, and actually not the opposite reason, but for a similar reason to their placement on the Indian curriculum, which was that there wasn't a lot of explicit sex in Shakespeare's plays. And so that was one of the things that was really important to the Puritans, who were, some of the people who were influencing the first schools. But, there's a lot of great work on the history of Shakespeare in American education. And I'm trying to think of some of the first books on it. But there's Michael Bristol's work on Shakespeare in America is quite good. James Shapiro, his new book, Shakespeare in a Divided America, touches a little bit on Shakespeare's use in education. So it sort of runs parallel, but not exactly the same, because we didn't have the same type of, it wasn't the same type of colonial rule here.
Great, thank you. This question comes from Carl. Carl is outside of Philadelphia. Earlier in the chat box, Josh Cabot, our TA tonight, who I believe has met you at the Folger and is very familiar with the Theater for a New Audience. Josh mentioned the #DisruptTexts in the chat box. He noted that it's a group that does very thought-provoking, intelligent work around English language arts instruction. Here's Carl's question in response to that. One challenging point raised by the Disrupt Text leader, Lorena Germain, is that, quote, Shakespeare, like any other playwright, no more and no less, has literary merit. He's not universal in the same way that other authors are not. He is not more timeless than anyone else. Carl would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. I mean, I actually think that Shakespeare is good in terms of, I think the quality of the work is really good. It's really amazing poetry. And to me, it is better than Ben Jonson, and it is better than his kind of Renaissance contemporaries. Do I think that it has to, do we have to have a scale? No, I think what I'm trying to get at is that you don't have to choose X or Y, but actually creating dialogues is more important. I'm not wholly convinced that this will probably be the most controversial thing I say, but I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm saying I'm not wholly convinced that Shakespeare will still be on our curriculum in 150 years. And that's only because the language will be so far removed. I mean, we're already 400 years removed from Shakespeare's Renaissance English. I think in another 150 years, it will be so much farther that it might read more like Chaucer does to us in our current moment, which is Chaucer is great and wonderful. I love Chaucer. I love reading Chaucer. I love reciting Chaucer. I can still recite the whole prologue to Canterbury Tales by heart in Middle English. So I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying Chaucer is not a mainstay in our curriculum anymore because the language gap is too big. Now, it is totally possible to teach it well and to teach it with pleasure so the students experience pleasure, but it's not going to be for everyone. And I'm not sure if I worry. I just think that may be where we are with Shakespeare in 150 years. So that's just something to ponder. Like, we're still in a space where Shakespeare's English, we think that it should be approachable. We think it should be close enough to us that we teach it. But I'm not sure that will continue to be the case. So
very interesting.
That was a long answer for that question.
That's great. Thank you. This question comes from Caroline. Carolyn is from Winchester, Virginia, up in the, well, you know where Winchester is, not far from Columbia, over on 66. She asks, do you have any reading suggestions for your current project of advising the Broadway production and the implications and consciousness of casting actors of color, differently abled actors and trans actors, etc.?
Well, what I can say is the tickets are very expensive, but I think it would be really worth it if you go to Broadway to see this show. It's only on for, I think, 15 weeks. So it's a short, limited run. And I think because I'm hired by the show, I don't think that I personally can write about it in an academic way. That would be a conflict of interest. But I think that I might have an opportunity to write something in the program about the intentionality. And so that might be a place to look in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. One last question before we move on. Can you talk a little bit, please, about the difference? I'm going to ask this in the context of Shakespeare in tonight's conversation, but you could certainly apply this to a variety of other writers and poets, playwrights. Talk to us a little bit about the difference of accessing stage and performance versus text, and the value of one or the other for younger students.
So it's such a good question. And I've taken recently to saying this as often as possible in the hopes that the universe will hear me. But if I were Jeff Bezos and I had trillions of dollars, I would give money so that every 8-year-old could go see at least 2 live shows when they're 8. And one should be a straight play, which I think should be Shakespeare, and one could be a musical. Because it is a completely different experience to encounter Shakespeare for the first time on the page versus on the stage. And I just want to say that young people, and my own children starting at age 4, both of them, experienced Shakespeare in the theater first. They don't have hang-ups about Shakespeare's language. They're young enough to think that all language is kind of difficult to understand, and maybe you won't understand everything the adults are saying. And so when you're watching a play, they don't come in with any hang-ups or anxieties about Shakespeare. Whereas if you encounter it on the page for the first time, and whatever age that is, but usually it's occurring around 11, 12, 13 for the first time on the page, it can be quite intimidating. And again, it's because that language is so divorced from our contemporary 21st century English. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to get students into that 400-year-old language. And it can be incredibly rewarding, but it usually is an easier jump to get people in if they see it on stage for the first time.
That's great.
And I think that's why a lot of teachers are now employing performance-based approaches. So I can come back to that.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the point, but is that why events and plays like Hamilton are so powerful to so many people? Is it that performance?
It is, and it's not. I mean, I don't want to get woo-woo about it, right? Like, it's not. I mean, I think there is something special about like being in a room and experiencing something with a live audience, but that's not even it. For me, it's literally the language. It takes about what they call it, the Shakespeare Effect. It takes the first 10 minutes, you're like, oh my God, I don't understand anything. And then after 10 minutes, like your brain like just gives over to it and realizes that you can understand what's happening if you're reading the mixture of the body language and movement and blocking and staging and the words together. And suddenly you're not worrying anymore that you're listening to poetry. So I do think there is something both about, like, you know, what I will call the woo-woo of being in a live performance space with a collective audience. But there's also something about like all the context clues that you get from watching Shakespeare in action.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, let's go ahead and move forward. As the moderator, I'm also forced to be the timekeeper. So we have about 40 minutes or so.
And I think I should be well under that. So, okay. So in thinking about how you can encourage an oppositional gaze or decolonized thinking in your Shakespeare classroom, I think one of the things that you can start with is by encouraging juxtaposition. So it's not just creating juxtaposition, right? So it's not just that you say we should read August Wilson's King Hedley next to William Shakespeare's King Lear, which, by the way, do go really well together. It's that you also allow your students to bring in things that they want to juxtapose with Shakespeare. And again, this is part of that, like, you're going to have to give up some of your control as in the kind of older hierarchical model of teaching and allow for a little bit of kind of leveling with your class, with your students. And this means that you don't allow your students to treat Shakespeare's works as separate or apart, something frozen in a distant past that has no bearing on our world today. As many people have written about, some of our greatest authors, like Toni Morrison, were deeply, deeply influenced and engaged with Shakespeare. And so they're not, Shakespeare doesn't have to just be done in the month that you do Shakespeare, but maybe like when you're reading some other texts, you could bring in parts. We know that students learn best through comparing and contrasting, that's something that their brains kind of hook onto naturally, and so why not allow that? And this can be done by comparing his works to any contemporary works. And I'll just go back to say that Migdalia Cruz, amazing Latinx playwright and director, and she's got a kind of translation of Macbeth that's quite wonderful. Madeleine Syat is a Mohican playwright and director, and she started off by translating Shakespeare into Mohegan, but then she's also written a play exploring what it means to be a Native person engaging with Shakespeare. So, like, you know, I think she's asking very contemporary questions, but again, like, I think the juxtaposition with Shakespeare works really well. And Shakespeare's influenced, of course, so many contemporary authors and artists, visual artists too. Keith Hamilton Cobb happens to be an actor who wrote a fantastic play called American Moor that's published, and it's about a Black actor going to audition for Othello and a white director telling him how to be the Black character. It's brilliant. It is super brilliant. And Andy, to bring it back to Kim Hall, you see in Keith Hamilton Cobb's hand is Kim Hall's edition of Othello. So the worlds do come back. Tunderai, I think his last name is pronounced Amunyevu, is a Zimbabwean playwright, and he has also written a play about Shakespeare called The Moors, and it's quite brilliant and interesting. So I just feel like there's so many ways to allow dialogues to exist. Jay-Z, of course, he's got a lot to say about Shakespeare, a lot. And if you explore some of his interviews, Shakespeare keeps coming up, and he keeps asking interviewers who are challenging him about why he thinks he's the best. And he keeps saying, why don't you think I'm Shakespeare? And he said this numerous times. It's really interesting. So, you know, why not allow your students to bring that into the classroom? I'm not saying you need to bring this all to them. Sometimes that's interesting, but what might be more interesting is allowing your students to bring it to you. Allow the text to exist in debate form. Okay, so here are images of the plays that I sort of alluded to. So King Hedley II by August Wilson is a direct response to Shakespeare. Toni Morrison's response play to Othello is called Desdemona. It's really haunting and powerful, set in the afterlife, where Morrison wanted the characters in Othello to have an eternity to work out their issues. It's really, really profound. So above that is Migdalia Cruz's translation of Richard III. And if you all aren't aware, there's a new series of Shakespeare's plays translated into contemporary poetry, written by contemporary authors. They're not meant to be a replacement of Shakespeare's works, but Shakespeare exists in translation in every other country. In Japan, there are Japanese translations. There's a really long, robust history of German translations of Shakespeare. I mentioned Madeleine Syat's Mohegan translation. So Shakespeare exists in translation all over the world. It's only in English-speaking countries that we're a little iffy about translating them into contemporary English. But this play series by what's called Play On Shakespeare is really wonderful, and I think would be a great teaching tool to think about what are the subtle differences that make it contemporary English. Madeleine Syat's one-woman play about her relationship with Shakespeare is called Where We Belong. It's currently being performed across the country, so you might look into that. This is Keith Hamilton Cobb's play American Moor that I mentioned, which is about a Black actor auditioning to play Othello. And then Tundai's play The Moors, which is another. And this one is intended for younger students. So I think this is intended for like 11 to 18-year-olds. Okay, so when we think about juxtaposition and you think about decolonizing your classroom, there's a way in which Shakespeare is often used as like a vehicle to explain history. And as Laura Turchi and I attempt to write about in our book, Teaching Shakespeare with Purpose, history exists in Shakespeare's plays in multiple forms. So there are always multiple histories to be told, multiple layers to history when one is dealing with Shakespeare's plays, because they've been canonized for so long, and because the plays themselves are often dealing with older history. So Shakespeare, because Holinshed's Chronicles, which is the first history of England, Ireland, and Scotland, when it was published when Shakespeare was alive, and he was clearly using them, this history book, the first history book, to come up with some of the plots for his plays. He's dealing with an older past, whether it's ancient Rome or ancient Egypt or, older England or Scotland. So he's got multiple histories going on in his plays as well, because of course, many of the plays are commenting on his current political moment, but they're also looking backwards in time. But that's the way that we are experiencing Shakespeare now. We've got not only the multiple histories in his plays, but also now the 400 years of performance history. So one great example, I always come back to Titus Andronicus because it is my favorite. Titus Andronicus is amazing because it was Shakespeare's first tragedy. It's also amazing because it provides us with the only visual representation of a play by Shakespeare created during Shakespeare's time. And this drawing on the left-hand side is called the Peacham Drawing. And Henry Peacham, we think, went to the Globe to see Titus Andronicus and then went home and in his diary book drew a picture of the cast. Notice there's a Black character at the end. And then wrote down a lot of the lines that he remembered. What's interesting about this image is that you can see, even though the play is set in ancient Rome, you've got a variety of costuming going on. They're not all wearing togas. This looks vaguely like a toga, but these look like more contemporary to Shakespeare's Spanish outfits. And Aaron the Moor looks like, I'm not sure if that looks like it, you know, it doesn't look Roman or Egyptian or anything like that. So again, like as visual evidence from Shakespeare's time, it looks like he's got a whole bunch of different time period costumes going on, even in a play that was set in ancient Rome. I point this out because the first famous Black American Shakespeare actor named Ira Aldridge performed in Titus Andronicus throughout his career. And we have some images of him doing those performances, drawings and daguerreotypes. And so you can see that his costuming in 1851 is different than in 1595. And then there's also a really interesting film version of Titus Andronicus called Titus that was directed by Julie Taymor in 1999, starring the great Harry Lennox as Aaron the Moor. So again, the point I'm trying to make is that in Shakespeare's plays, and because of the 400 years that separates us from Shakespeare's plays, there's always ways for you to encourage a multiplicity of history to be explored. Shakespeare doesn't just have to be the container in which you teach the Renaissance. Shakespeare's an excellent container to think about 19th century American performance history, or actually late 20th century film history, when there was a whole rash of Shakespeare films that were quite popular. So allow multiple histories to be part of your discussion of Shakespeare. Okay, and then, yes, and of course, allow the present to creep into your discussions. It doesn't have to be that if students misread a line, as this code switch piece does, which is fabulous, it's okay. Like, anachronisms should be allowed. Shakespeare did this himself, which I don't think you need to authorize it by saying that, but it's interesting to think about, if you misread something, what can be discovered there? What new vistas are opened up? So I usually will correct my students if they make this kind of error, where it's about like who created the word swagger, which is hilarious. But I think, like, you can say, actually, that's not historically true, but let's put them next to each other and see what happens. So I think allowing the present to creep into your discussions and to reside in your discussions will also help you to create a decolonized classroom. And then ambiguity and multiple meanings have always existed, and I don't think should be avoided, right? And the most famous, hilarious one is in Huckleberry Finn, where Mark Twain has the Duke and the Dauphin, who are putting on their play, completely misremember and misread the famous Hamlet soliloquy from Act 3, Scene 1, where, as you can see on the left side, that in the Shakespearean context, a bare bodkin is actually a weapon that is not sheathed. But of course, in the Duke and Dauphin's understanding to be or not to be, that is the bare bodkin that makes calamities of so long a life, right? Like, that misreading is hilarious, but also, like, maybe that's okay, and maybe that's really fruitful. Maybe allowing those things to be explored fully is the way to go. So I'll say that the field, if you think about Shakespeare studies, the field has really opened up in the last 20 years with multiple new areas of exploration that simply did not exist when I was in college or graduate school. So one of them is pre-modern critical race studies, and Kim Hall, just to keep her in circulation, is sort of one of the foremothers of that field. But we also get like early modern affect studies. Carol Mejia LaPearl has been working on an amazing collection that looks at race and affect in Shakespeare. Early modern disability studies, Alison Hobgood has been at the forefront of that. Queer studies, Ian Smith and many others have been exploring queerness in Shakespeare, again, just in the past 20, 25 years. A field that has just opened up, I would say, in the last 5 years is asexuality studies, and Liza Blake is really at the forefront of that. And then there's also tons of new work on early modern animal studies and thinking about the ways that animals make meaning in these plays. So these are all what I think are good examples of oppositional gazes in action. And I can say, for example, that the asexuality studies done by Liza Blake, she was an undergraduate at George Washington University when I was a professor there. So here's someone who was in a classroom who has now created an entirely new field of study. So that's, to me, where we want to be. And I'll just say that a place that I think is doing this well at the moment is the Shakespeare Center of LA that has just received a large Department of Education grant for a Shakespeare and Social Justice in Arts Education program. And in this, I'm just going to read from their grant because it's quite powerful and I think would be a great resource for anyone who's interested. But one of their goals, and this is from their grant, is to integrate arts education in high schools through alignment of Shakespeare works with academic and social justice standards, and that they will create a curriculum for teaching Shakespeare and social justice that is aligned with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice standards and built around an interdisciplinary multimedia repository of arts-enriched techniques through collaboration of students, teaching artists, principals, teachers, and others. And that the student voices are really guiding the development of this curriculum development. So again, if you're interested in the Shakespeare Center LA grant, you can contact Laura Turchi because I know that she's working on that grant. So where will you, oh, I'm sorry, I'll go back.
Okay. Yep.
Where will your students take you if you allow them the freedom to bring their full identities, their full selves, their eyed-awry lenses to the classroom? Because I can't answer that question, I'm excited to continue to explore it with them, right? Like Shakespeare keeps becoming anew for me because the students are teaching me new ways to read the text. A decolonized Shakespeare classroom will take us to multiple new planets, asteroids, and universes, and we should not ask for or expect less of our students. I'll pause there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor. And we do have some questions that are queuing up, and we've got plenty of time to sort of get into these kinds of topics. The first question, I think, is intended to get a little bit of guidance when working with younger students. You mentioned the value of introducing students or children as young as 8 to the stage. Of course, in text, maybe it's in early middle school, late upper elementary, 11, 12. In your opinion, are there certain plays, or is there certain portions of Shakespeare that is meaningful to be first? In other words, you get that when you get the first one, that's going to open up or close a lot of doors. Is there a sort of a skeleton key text that really would, in your opinion, engage students?
I mean, not for the youngest, but I think for me, Titus Andronicus is the perfect gateway Shakespeare play, and because it's bonkers, and students every time are shocked by it. But I would say that would be appropriate for high school and above. If we're thinking about for younger students, I do think Romeo and Juliet still works really well, right? That there's ways to explore the tensions between the Montagues and Capulets that will be interesting to the students. And there's ways to explore that Romeo and Juliet's desires to break away from their families that still resonates with the students. You know, I think like the rule of thumb has always been that younger students like Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream because they're kind of fantastical in some ways. I do think any of the romances, which are Shakespeare's later plays, so that's Pericles, Cymbeline, Winter's Tale, they all have like really amazing magical moments in them, like actual magical moments in them that I think are interesting to explore with younger students. The witches in Macbeth, I mean, I remember reading the witches scenes in my closet with a flashlight when I was 8. So I do think that Macbeth is, you know, is great for younger students as well. I also think like you should think, what is it that you want them, if you're not introducing them through performance, what is it that you want your young students to get out of that encounter with Shakespeare? Is it some set of facts? Is it some sense of ownership? Is it some you know, sense of wonder? I mean, I think those, so Laura Turchi and I in our book on teaching Shakespeare with Purpose, really ask teachers to think about like those framing questions before you start. And I think that once you really sit down and say, like, what is it that I want them to get out of this? Then you go backwards and say, okay, so then how do I design this in such a way that that's the outcome? And it's okay if it's like, if the answer is pure pleasure or thinking that Shakespeare is pleasurable, that's a fine desired outcome for a first experience. But then like, what is it that, how do you achieve that, right? Like, and what do you have to strip away? And Laura and I also say that you don't have to teach all the plays, like all of the play all the time, right? Sometimes a dipping in and out allows students to explore it for themselves, which might be more powerful. Like we've in the American education system have traditionally said, like you start with act 1, scene 1, and you end at act 5, scene whatever, and you do this kind of relentless march through the text. I remember being taught listening to a record of Olivier doing Hamlet when I was in high school at Centennial High School. So, right. You know, I don't know that you have to do that. You can just go in and why not just do the witches scene or do this magical scene or do this weird scene. The director, Peter Sellers, who does these, you know, wonderfully bizarre Shakespeare productions, he always says that the weirdest and most important scenes are the scenes between the servants who usually don't have names, or like it's like Captain 1 and Captain 2, like the scenes that are always cut in production, that those scenes are the most important ones because you get to see through them how power works. So I always love the idea of taking some rando scene between servants talking about other characters and asking the students, what world do you think exists through this discussion? So anyway, fantastic. You don't have to do the whole text.
That's really great advice. Thank you. You've talked a lot tonight about text and about viewing performance. What about acting? Talk to us a little bit about the value of acting some of these plays or scenes.
Yeah. And I do think that, like, I know a lot of theater companies and some educators are working through performance-based models, which I think is probably the best way to go. I will say there are 2 ways to do it. One is that you actually get people up on their feet and acting. And I think like the Folger Shakespeare Library, their education program really values the getting up on your feet and doing it. I also think it's quite powerful for students to imagine a production, even if they don't have to do it. And so like I often will spend, and it's amazing how heated and like tense the arguments will be when I ask the students, where is Hamlet sitting in that first scene where we encounter him in the play Hamlet, because his mother's there, his uncle / stepfather is there. Like, who's next to whom, and what do we know about the characters based on that? My students will like get into knockdown, drag out fights over that. And it doesn't mean that they actually have to physically get up and do it, but by debating what it means, like how they're coming to their ideas, you realize that impacts the way they understand the end of the play. And that's something that I always try and impart to my students, is like, things that you think that you've just are universal in kind of the understanding of the play might just be your interpretation. And so if you just take out one element and change it, how does that change your whole understanding of the play? So I do think performance-based practices are fantastic. I think getting on your feet is useful. I also think imagining a production is very useful too.
That's great. Thank you. My next question, I'm going to ask you to be a little bit vulnerable here, I think. Not that you haven't been so far, but you've mentioned several times early on, you talked about the way that every couple of months, you get sort of steamrolled by alt-right kinds of writings. Later in your talk tonight, you mentioned the 1619 Project. And of course, all educators at all levels, every K-12 teacher here, college educators, we're constantly sort of either explicitly or implicitly defending our choices and talking about and being stuck in this kind of culture war that's been manufactured. So I've got a two-part question for you. The first question is, as best you can, what are the most common arguments against what you've been sharing with us tonight that you've heard from these kinds of critics, whether it's in writing or whether it's in conversation, or maybe it's even things that you've read that they're discussing? And then secondly, what is a really powerful, short, concise response that all of our educators can internalize when they make these decisions in their classrooms, with their curriculum, with their students? If they do go down this road, if they embrace this, as I suspect most of them do, what can you share that will help them diffuse the criticism that might come their way?
So I think the criticism that I hear the most, and because I'm not in K through 12 schools, I'm not getting the same kind of resistance. As in the university setting, it's slightly different. But the resistance that I hear from the alt-right media is that I somehow want to attack Shakespeare's value, or that I want to impose a woke history onto Shakespeare, that I'm doing some sort of like violence to Shakespeare. And what I think is similar to what's similar to my work to what is happening in the 1619 Project is that sometimes when you're revealing a history that has not been said out loud before, it can make people anxious. And so I think allowing people to say what they're anxious about, like if I respond back to them, I don't want to cancel Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare has immense value. What is it that I said that is making you anxious? Then there's a different kind of conversation that goes on. And I do allow in my classrooms, I do say that we're all going to make mistakes, and we're probably going to offend each other, and the plays are going to offend us. And we just have to do it together, because that's how you learn. Like, that's actually how you learn. Like, if we thought that Shakespeare was something that you could just go off and do on your own now, we wouldn't teach it, right? Like, just go and read it for fun, right? Like, no, but it's actually quite difficult. And there are things that we need to debate in it. Sometimes it's a theme. Sometimes it's actually like some racial rhetoric, right? I mean, like Romeo says that Juliet shines like a pearl in an Ethiop's ear. Right, that's very clear Renaissance rhetoric about race and beauty. We should be able to talk about that now, and we can say, yeah, that's 400 years old. I don't need Shakespeare to apologize for it, but I need us to be able to like at least talk about what that means, what it meant then, what it meant in the 19th century, what it might mean now, you know, like again, the multiple histories. So I do try and allow for as much, I don't want to say dissent, but it's like open conversation about how everyone feels in the moment, or if they're feeling threatened, why, and how we can address that.
Fantastic.
I don't know if
Thank you.
I think enough.
I think it does, and you know, I think if nothing else, I think what my goal would be for these kinds of conversations and webinars is to, you know, the more you know, the better off you can be as an educator, and that, again, that includes the choices you make, the curriculum that you're teaching, the conversations that you're facilitating. So having you frame it that way is really helpful. This next question comes from Tisha Hooks. Tisha is joining us from Connecticut. And here's her question. One of the things you mentioned tonight was Bell Hooks's discussion of the oppositional gaze. Might you say something about, for lack of a better phrase, the oppositional ear? Is this something you discuss or address in the classroom, ideas about rhythm, emphasis, or performance?
So good. And yes, I do, because for example, there was the most beautiful production of Much Ado About Nothing in the park right before the pandemic with an all-black cast. And it's actually available on Great Performances. So you can see it through streaming or through, if you can get the DVD if you still have, you know, DVDs. But what's amazing about that production was that the director, Kenny Leon, asked his black cast to use their, you know, whatever their black American rhythm was, and not to use what actors who are trained actors in classical programs are often taught, RP, which is received pronunciation, which is kind of like a, you know, a kind of not fake British, but a sort of fake British sound. And he said, let's not do that. Let's like bring, if you're like from the South, bring your Southern, you know, kind of rhythms to it. And it sounded fantastic. It was the most beautiful sounding piece. It looked gorgeous, but it also sounded gorgeous. And like, so one of the lines, I can't remember the actor's name who played Beatrice, but she was just so wonderful. And she had a line where she was like, you know, 'cause, and it was like, you know, of course, Shakespeare would not have imagined that his Beatrice would sound like that, but it definitely brought an oppositional ear, and it brought the poetry out in a very different way for me. And I just think orally it was incredible. So Tisha, so like that would be a really good resource to use to think about an oppositional ear.
That's great, thank you. And I want to thank and note that Josh Cabot, our TA tonight, has been an expert Googler as you've been speaking, and most of what you've said and mentioned, he's gone online, he's found it, he's dropped the links into the chat box. And thank you, Josh, for doing that.
Thanks, Josh. Since I can't multitask it, I'm always in awe of people who do that.
Here's my last question for you as we're drawing to a conclusion tonight. I'm going to make the assumption that you either do have or continue to teach Shakespeare in your own classes, undergraduate students, ASU students. What is generally the response you get, positive or negative, and things that as an educator you try to get in front of as you introduce Shakespeare to them?
I do still teach Shakespeare to undergraduates, graduates, and I teach a class on teaching Shakespeare to Arizona high school teachers, which I'll be teaching in the spring. So I'll give different responses to the different groups. The ASU undergraduates, by and large, the students who take that class are non-English majors, and they're taking a Shakespeare class as an elective. And they are amazing because Arizona State University is a Hispanic serving institution. It's got the largest Native American student population. It's got, I think it's somewhere close to 50% or more first generation college students. These are not people who necessarily have a deep, rich Shakespeare background. Most of my students have never been to a play. So they come pretty blank. They may or may not have had Shakespeare in high school as well, which is also interesting to me. And I always start all of my classes, undergraduate classes, with Titus Andronicus. I feel like this is I hope you all go off and read this play because you'll see what I'm talking about. If you've never taught it before, it's the best teaching play. And the students from the beginning are hooked and they'll come in and they're like, wait, Shakespeare wrote this? It has a joke in it like this. The black man who's had an affair with the white woman, and she just gave birth to a biracial baby. Her white sons confront the black man, and they say, "What have you done?" And they even say, "You have undone our mother." And Aaron the Moor says, "No, I have done her." It sounds so the students can't believe that it was written 400 years ago. But also all the themes in it. There's this horrible sexual violence, trauma, revenge, race, class, all of it is there. And so the students every year, that's the play on the, teacher evaluations. They'll be like, oh my God, Titus Andronicus. And then years later, students will come back to me. In fact, I got an email today from a student that I taught in 2004. And she said, I still think about Titus. So I do think that is, my undergrads are an unusual bunch because they're opting in, but they also know nothing about Shakespeare. And I also have had a lot of Spanish-speaking students who are fully bilingual, but when they speak to each other, they will speak in Spanish. So I had a class where there was a group of 5 students who sat together, and when they were talking to each other, they spoke all in Spanish. When they were reading Shakespeare, they were reading Renaissance English. And then when they were talking to the rest of the class, they were speaking in contemporary English. And I was like, look at this group. You are this is what I want for the future of the world. So that's one. The graduate students, I think, have more anxiety about Shakespeare. And more anxiety about maybe they haven't read all the plays, or maybe they've never seen a play, or whereas my undergraduates kind of are like, yay, I want this. The graduates feel a lot of the graduate student anxiety. And then my Arizona high school teachers have immense anxiety. If I could amplify the graduate student anxiety to a whole other level, all of their feelings of inadequacy are writ large in the class, because they're like, I was, I did history as an undergrad, and now I'm teaching at this high school, and I have to teach the Shakespeare unit all of a sudden. And maybe I've read 2 Shakespeare plays. So they just have so much anxiety about feeling that they need to be the expert. So all the work that I do with Arizona high school teachers is, you don't have to be the expert. Why should you be the expert? This is old stuff. Maybe you go in and say, I'm not the expert. What happens? Then you explore with your students. You have then successfully broken that hierarchy, which I think you would want to break if you have a decolonized classroom. So I just give them steps about how to feel like there's control in the class through this mutual exploration. And they do say, because I teach them once a week, they go off and teach the rest of the week, and I see them next week, and they're like, I can't believe it worked. That thing that you told me to do worked. I'm like, yes, it does. So those would be the different kinds of reactions that I've gotten to teaching Shakespeare.
Well, I wish that my computer screen was a window and I could see the reactions of our audience tonight. I suspect it's much like mine, which is deep gratitude for your time with us and for shining some light on these topics. Professor Thompson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will say to any of the teachers, do feel free to reach out to me personally. You can find my email very easily if you need any help or any guidance or just want an ear.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank all of our audience for joining us tonight. We do appreciate your continued involvement with and support of the center. I dropped a link to the Humanities in Class community survey back in the chat box. We'd love to have your reflections and your insights on the work that we're doing, and that will enter you into the next 5 drawings. So the sooner you complete that survey, the more likely it is that you will be selected for one of the prizes. Please also follow our social media feeds for upcoming opportunities. That does include our next webinar, which is Thursday night. I'll be joined by Dale Marriage, who is a professor of journalism at Columbia University, one of Professor Thompson's schools. The title is, Will the 20s Be the 30s? Narrative Journalism and Lessons from the Great Depression. We would love to have you joining us. Please share this with your colleagues and have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you next time in the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.